This wasn't a screaming match. There were no insults, no slammed desks, no dramatic outbursts. And that's exactly why it was so uncomfortable to watch. Because in a quiet Senate hearing room, with no theatrics and no raised voices, a senior Australian minister calmly talked himself into a contradiction he couldn't escape. And the more he tried to explain it, the worse it got. By the end of the exchange, one thing was painfully clear. The government had reassured Australians about national security without being able to explain why. Before we go any further, take a second and tell me this in the comments. Do you trust a politician more or less when they say, "not to my knowledge"? Because that phrase is about to come up a lot, and once you hear how it was used, you'll understand why this moment isn't going away. It started as a routine Senate estimates hearing, the kind most Australians never watch. Dry, procedural, usually forgotten within hours, until Murray Watt opened his mouth. The topic was the return of Australians from Syria and Iraq, specifically women and children who had lived in areas once controlled by ISIS, a sensitive issue, one that demands precision, care, absolute clarity. And at first, that's exactly what Watt projected. He drew a clear distinction between this group and previous returnees. Earlier cohorts, he said, included ISIS fighters. This time, it was women and children, not fighters. Different situation, different risk profile. On the surface, it sounded reassuring, almost comforting. And that's important because reassurance carries weight. When a minister reassures the public on national security, Australians assume that reassurance is backed by briefings, intelligence, and facts. But that assumption is where the problem began, because confidence, when it isn't backed by evidence, doesn't calm people, it sets a trap. And Senator James Paterson was about to spring it. But before we get there, quick check. If you're still with me, drop a comment saying where you're watching from. I want to see how far this conversation reaches.
Then you went on to say, and this group were not ISIS fighters. So
I think
what information did
that.
Minister?
Feel free to have
I haven't finished my question. I haven't finished my question, Minister. What information do you have to satisfy yourself that neither of these adults who've returned have committed any terrorism offences and were not ISIS fighters?
Well, as Ms Foster has said, I think they are questions that should be directed to the security agencies, who are in a better position to understand what should and should not be put in the public domain.
But you just told us moments ago these people were not ISIS fighters. How did you know that?
Well, no. Feel free to go back and have a look at the transcript. I'm pretty sure that's not what I said.
Well, I'm pretty sure it is what you said, and we'll get that transcript and I'll provide it to you. I'll quote it back to you directly. So are you now saying you don't know whether or not these people were ISIS fighters or not?
The point I was making was that what we know from this question on notice is that the 40 returnees, at least under the coalition government, those who came under between 2013 and 2017, included some who fought for ISIL, some who've not fought but provided support to ISIL, and a few who had joined other Islamic extremist groups.
And then you drew a distinction between that cohort and this cohort. So what was the information you were relying on to make that distinction?
I can't add anything to the answers I've already given you.
Because you don't know?
Because I've already answered your question several times.
Was it just a speculative comment that you made?
Feel free to have a look at my earlier answers.
Were you making an assumption because of their gender that they weren't ISIS fighters? What was the reason?
Feel free to have a look at my earlier answers.
Well, Minister, it would be very helpful if you could just explain to me what the basis of your statement was. Have you been briefed on this matter?
The basis of my statement was the question on notice that was answered back in 2017, 2018, where under a coalition government we saw around 40 people who had fought for ISIL and joined other Islamic extremist groups who returned to Australia. That was the basis for my statement.
Yes, but you were also commenting on the particulars of this cohort and the difference with previous cohorts. So I'll ask again, have you been briefed on these matters?
Before we go any further, take a quick second to hit the subscribe button. Believe it or not, it really helps and support the channel. If you've already subscribed, thank you, and if not, now's the perfect time.
Personally, I mean, I had a briefing from the Minister's office to prepare for estimates, but that's the extent of my knowledge.
And in that briefing, did they tell you whether or not these returnees had committed any terrorism offences while they're offshore?
The information I've given you today is based on the briefings that I received, and any further questions about the detail of these returnees should be put to security agencies.
Right, so I am none the wiser as to where you got your confidence that these returnees are different from the previous returnees.
Well, I'm sure the security agencies will be happy to provide you whatever information they can when they appear later today.
Okay, you also said that there are persons of interest in this cohort. What about them makes them persons of interest?
Well, again, I wouldn't mind seeing what I actually said. What I think I said was that our agencies are aware of who the persons of interest are in this cohort.
Okay, so tell me about that. On what basis are they persons of interest?
I'm not a minister who turns up and breaches national security rules.
Well, not deliberately, I'm sure, but you might have inadvertently.
Feel free to put those questions to the security agencies when they appear.
Okay, here's your direct quote. I'm going to help you here, Minister. You said, "These 2 women and 4 children, it is worth remembering that between 1 January 2013 and 16 October 2017, almost all of which was under a coalition government, we saw returnees from the conflict in Syria and Iraq number around 40, according to that question on notice. And in fact, they were not women and children, they were fighters. They were ISIL and ISIS fighters who returned. So I think some context is probably useful in this debate." So can you confirm where you became confident that these women are not in fact ISIL or ISIS fighters?
I don't think the quote that you just read back has me saying that. I think you're trying to. I think you're misrepresenting what I said.
You just said that they were. You referred to this cohort as 2 women and 2 children, and then you said this other cohort you're talking about were not women and children; they were fighters. So, is it because of their gender that you've made an assumption that they haven't committed a terrorist offence?
No. You're misrepresenting what I said. What I said is that this group are women and children. I said that group that returned under the coalition, many more, I might add, like 7 times as many, at least, were fighters. That's what I said.
Yeah. So
you're trying to conflate what I've said, and I haven't made that point that you're trying to.
What is the relevance of the fact that they're women and children, if not to distinguish them from ISIL fighters? You think that you appear to think that's a meaningful distinction.
Again, you can try and conflate different sentences to make a point that you want to make. What my statement is factually correct. Feel free to read it back out.
Minister,
feel free to read it back out.
Are you aware whether or not any
and then
women...
everyone listening can judge whether you're conflating it and misrepresenting
Thanks, Minister. Are you aware...
You don't want to read it back out?
Minister, are you aware whether any women have fought for ISIS?
Oh, I think historically it's known that some women have fought for ISIS.
Okay, so explain to me then the distinction that you were drawing between these returnees and those ones.
Feel free to read my statement back.
Okay, all right, we can do it again if you want. I think it's on the Hansard record, but let's do it. These 2 women and 4 children, it is worth remembering that between 1 January 2013 and 16 October 2017, almost all of which was under a coalition government, we saw returnees from the conflict in Syria and Iraq number around 40, according to that question on notice, and in fact, they were not women and children, they were fighters. They were ISIL and ISIS fighters who returned, so I think some context is probably useful in this debate. Why is their gender relevant? What's the distinction between an ISIS fighter, whether they're male or female?
I was just giving you a factual statement that the 6 people we are talking about here are women and children.
Yes.
I was giving you a factual statement that under the coalition government, between 2013 and 2017 alone, 40 people returned who were ISIL fighters or members of other terrorist organisations. They are factually correct statements. If you want to draw conclusions from that, that's up to you.
I think the conclusion's pretty clear, Minister, but let's move on to other areas.
For your assistant, Senator Hanson. Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few moments ago, the Minister drew a distinction between this returning cohort and previous returning cohorts by saying some of those previous people were ISIS fighters and these ones were not ISIS fighters. So can you confirm for me that there is no evidence or suspicion that these people were involved in any acts of terror or other terror offences while they were overseas?
Senator, that is an operational matter that would have to be referred to security, law enforcement agencies, but I can say not to our knowledge.
Right, well, so the Minister was able to. So there's no suspicion that either of the adults in this cohort committed any terrorism offence while they're overseas.
Senator, I'm very conscious that I don't know all of the information that might be available to security and intelligence and law enforcement agencies, nor whether or not any future investigation or prosecution might take place, and therefore I think it would be not appropriate for me to speculate about that. Those questions could go to them and they could make a judgment about whether or not
and
it
they
was
will, but
appropriate
you
to
just said
answer.
in your previous answer you don't believe so. So just to be clear, they did not commit any declared area offence by being in a declared area while they're overseas?
So, Senator, what I said was not to my knowledge.
Yes.
But those questions are best addressed to the security, law enforcement, intelligence agencies.
What about associating with the terrorist organisation? Are we seriously saying that ISIS brides were not associated with the terrorist organisation, which is a crime under the Criminal Code?
So, Senator, I've said that I don't wish to do anything that would prejudice any future investigation.
Sure, but the Minister just told us these people were not ISIS fighters. They're different from previous cohorts.
No, what I said, what I did was read out to you a question on notice that was answered relating to the 40 returnees from the conflict in Syria and Iraq between 2013 and 2017 under the coalition government, and the answer to that question in notice said that that 40 included some who have fought for ISIL, some have not fought but provided support to ISIL, and a few who had joined other Islamic extremist groups.
This week, inside a Senate hearing room that was meant to focus on responsibility and oversight, Australians instead witnessed something very different. A senior minister, speaking under oath, gradually talked himself into a corner and then seemed unable to find a way out. What began as a standard national security discussion slowly transformed into one of the most awkward parliamentary moments in recent memory. As Senator James Paterson calmly and deliberately questioned Minister Murray Watt, viewers watched a methodical dismantling of the government's narrative around the return of Australians linked to ISIS. There was no yelling, no dramatic interruptions, no political grandstanding. Just steady questions, patient pauses, and answers that grew weaker with every exchange. At the centre of the hearing was the government's decision to return a group of Australians from Syria and Iraq. Minister Watt attempted to reassure the public by drawing a clear distinction between earlier returnees and the most recent group. According to him, previous cohorts included ISIS fighters, while this time it involved 2 women and children. On the surface, that distinction sounded comforting. It suggested lower risk and careful judgment. But reassurance without evidence is fragile, and Paterson quickly exposed that weakness. He asked what many Australians watching at home were already wondering. Was there any evidence or even suspicion that the adults in this group had been involved in terrorist activity overseas? The response was hesitant. Watt said it was not to his knowledge, before quickly adding that such matters were operational and handled by intelligence agencies. He insisted it was not his role to speculate. That answer immediately raised questions. Moments earlier, the minister had sounded confident enough to publicly separate these returnees from ISIS fighters. Now, he suddenly didn't know, couldn't say, or wouldn't say. Paterson didn't move on. He pressed further. Were these individuals involved in terrorism offences? Were they present in declared areas? Were they associated with ISIS, something that is itself a criminal offence under Australian law? Each time, Watt retreated to the same defence. He didn't want to prejudice investigations. Intelligence agencies were better placed to assess the situation. he wouldn't speculate, but the contradiction was already clear. You cannot simultaneously reassure the public and claim ignorance, and Paterson knew it. The tension in the room steadily increased as the inconsistency became impossible to ignore. Watt insisted he had not said what the transcript showed he had said. Paterson told him to read it again. He said he would, and he quoted it back word for word. What followed felt less like a policy debate and more like a courtroom cross-examination. The minister appeared increasingly uncomfortable, struggling to justify the confidence he had expressed only minutes earlier. Then came the moment that shifted the entire exchange. Paterson asked whether gender had influenced the assumption that these returnees were not ISIS fighters. It was a confronting question, but a legitimate one. Women have fought for ISIS. Women have recruited for ISIS. Women have enforced ISIS ideology. This is not speculation. It is documented fact. Watt rejected the suggestion outright and accused Paterson of misrepresenting his words. But when asked again to clearly explain the distinction he had drawn, the minister could not do it. Repeatedly, he returned to the same statement. This group consisted of women and children, while previous groups included fighters. When pressed on why that distinction mattered, why it was relevant to public safety, he had no clear answer. At one point, he said Australians could draw their own conclusions. That was the moment many viewers lost confidence. National security is not something you leave to interpretation. It is not a vibes-based exercise. Either you understand why a distinction matters, or you should not make it at all. Outside Parliament House, the reaction was swift. Social media lit up within hours. Veterans groups questioned the government's messaging. Jewish community leaders called for clearer explanations. Rural Australians, already feeling disconnected from Canberra, asked why ministers seemed unprepared on issues with real-world consequences. Even within Labor circles, there was quiet frustration that such a sensitive topic had been handled so poorly in public. By the following afternoon, the opposition openly described the exchange as an embarrassment, not because of political ideology, but because of competence. Australians expect ministers to understand the weight of their words, especially when discussing terrorism, intelligence, and public safety. This was never about scoring points. It was about whether the government actually knows who is returning to the country and why the public should feel confident about it. Internationally, the optics were no better. Australia has spent years presenting itself as firm and consistent on counter-terrorism. Allies watched these hearings. Analysts read transcripts. When a minister cannot explain the basis for his own statements, it raises uncomfortable questions about internal briefings and decision-making. That is what made this moment so damaging. Not one poorly chosen sentence, but a pattern. Confidence without evidence. Distinctions without explanations. Reassurance followed immediately by retreat. By the end of the hearing, Paterson didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need a dramatic closing line. The silence spoke for itself. So here we are, a week later. Australians are still asking the same questions. Who exactly are these returnees? What do we know? What don't we know? And why did a minister speak so confidently about a distinction he could not defend when challenged? Because if the government cannot answer those questions clearly in Parliament, what confidence should ordinary Australians have that the system is working behind the scenes? That is the real issue. That is why this moment matters. And that is why it is not going away. What do you think? Was this simply a clumsy explanation or something more serious? Should ministers be allowed to make public distinctions on national security without solid briefings? And after watching this exchange, do you feel reassured? Share your thoughts in the comments. Share this video so others can decide for themselves. And subscribe, because moments like this don't appear out of nowhere and they rarely end quietly.
Within hours, clips spread, not because of outrage, not because of drama, but because of discomfort. Veterans groups questioned the messaging. Community leaders asked for clarity. Analysts pointed out the risk of speaking loosely on counter-terrorism. Even within government circles, there was quiet frustration, not ideological, practical. This wasn't about left versus right, it was about preparation. Australia has spent decades building a reputation for consistency on counter-terrorism. Allies watch these hearings, they read transcripts. They don't care about spin. And when a minister can't explain the basis of his own distinction, it raises questions far beyond one exchange. Questions about briefings, about internal communication, about decision-making. That's why this moment mattered, not because someone lost their temper, but because someone lost control of their narrative. And once that happens, the damage spreads. A week later, Australians are still asking the same things. Who exactly are these returnees? What do we know? And what don't we know? And why did a minister speak with such certainty about something he couldn't defend? This wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a pattern. Confidence, contradiction, retreat. And that pattern erodes trust faster than any scandal. Because in national security, clarity isn't optional, it's the job. So the real question isn't whether Murray Watt misspoke, it's whether Australians should feel reassured by explanations that collapse under basic scrutiny. That's the issue. That's why this moment matters. And that's why it's not fading. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think this was just clumsy communication or something more serious? Should ministers be allowed to make public distinctions on national security without solid briefings? Drop your thoughts below, read what others are saying, and if this breakdown helped you see the exchange differently, share it. Subscribe too, because moments like this don't happen in isolation. They're signals. And the people who ignore signals are always the last ones surprised by what comes next.